Well, welcome to all who are just joining us now for our second in our Advent series of webinars on Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti. I think about half of us are here, so I'll just give it another moment or two, and then we will get started with this week's topic. Welcome, Father Sadhanala, joining our panel today.
Excellent, excellent.
Yes.
We've got some real wisdom on the panel.
We certainly do.
Thank you.
So for those who are here so far, I'm Kathy Camp, one of the pastoral associates at St. Joseph's Church, with Father Jim Schwartz, our pastor, with Father Sadhanala, our parochial vicar, and with Nancy Veronese moderating for us today and watching the chat and the Q&A, so that any thoughts you want to add, any questions, she'll be right on top of and will let us know. So we'll get started today with prayer. As we talked about last week, the conclusion of Pope Francis's encyclical has these two very, very beautiful prayers. So we'll open and close each time with those. So since you're all muted anyway, feel free to pray out loud if you would like. Pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. So today is our second session. We are now in our second week of Advent, and we hope that this time together will allow us to really be more intentional and conscious of Advent as a time of reflection, of quiet, of waiting, as Father Jim preached about yesterday. But while we're doing those seemingly more passive things, this can also be an intentional time of charity, of justice, of promoting peace in our world. And during this time of the pandemic, when so many of us are pretty well isolated at home, or certainly not doing many of the social things that we normally would be doing, it does seem like maybe an ironic time, but an important time to also be talking about this idea of fraternity and social friendship. So those are really the areas that we're focusing on during these 4 weeks, as Pope Francis has done. So this week we're on chapters 3 and 4. They, as usual with Pope Francis, have beautiful titles. Chapter 3, Envisaging and Engendering an Open World. And chapter 4, A Heart Open to the Whole World. So that would be our hearts he's talking about, and we'll spend time with that today. So we do encourage your interaction. You are very welcome, as one or two of you did, to email any thoughts, questions, just things that pop into your mind during the week. And certainly during the webinar, we really encourage you to be using the chat and the Q&A to share thoughts with the whole group. So we'll start you off today with a couple of things to think about, and then Nancy will be keeping an eye on that for us. We'll ask you to think about, anything that came up for you in this past week, anything that we had, talked about or even didn't talk about, some of the more provocative things, do we really believe and agree with Pope Francis that we live in a throwaway world? Do we see the same intrinsic dignity in every person, including
Yes, I'm on this webinar.
and refugees
Okay,
and people different from ourselves? And do you see your Advent prayer having been, invigorated in any way by some of these topics that we have been talking about this past week? So ask you to be thinking about those things, and feel free to jump in on the chat anytime. And in the meantime, Father Jim is going to get us started on chapter 3.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Just in general, the more and more I read of the writings and the thinkings and the homilies, the encyclicals of Pope Francis, the more that I am inspired by Pope Francis's vision of a gospel spirituality, which really challenges all of us. And I was talking to Father Bob Krekel this morning, our 92-year-old senior priest who really was recommending Pope Francis's latest book too, which is in conjunction with Austin Intervey. I'm not even sure the title, Called to Dream or something like that. But I would recommend to you also the latest book that Pope Francis has done in cooperation with another author whose name I can't think of right now. But again, it's just reflective of the beauty and the depth of Pope Francis's spirituality. And in this particular section, the call to fraternity, which is really a call to community, a call to church. It's a call to love. It's a call to be with one another, to encounter one another. Human beings are so made that they cannot live, develop, and find fulfillment except in the sincere gift of self to others. And this is taken from the Vatican II document, Gaudium and Spes. Nor can they fully know themselves apart from an encounter with other persons. No one can experience the true beauty of life without relating to others, without having real faces to love. This is part of the mystery of authentic human existence. And it's just reflects so beautifully. I mean, as I mentioned last week, from the very first pages of the Bible in the book of Genesis, the sacred author tells us that it is not good for us to be alone, that we are made to know, to love, to serve God and with one another. What we know about God is that, if you're trying to describe it, God is love. God is revealed to us in relation, the Trinity of persons, that we experience God's presence in the union, the relationship of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And as we seek to find our own spirituality, our way of becoming a disciple of the Lord Jesus, that our prayer is relational. What our prayer is, our conversation with the Lord. What our spirituality is, how we live out the two great commandments of love of God, of love of neighbor. To really experience that we are made for love. Some of the themes that we have been saying in our parish for the last couple of years, we are better together. We belong to each other. To be able to see that the call to fraternity, which is the law to encounter, to listen, to dialogue, to be with each other, is the DNA of a gospel way of living. There's no way that we can live out our spirituality in isolation. Even the monks at Bafar, their commitment is they express their solidarity with each other. Their solidarity with the church, with all of God's creation, with God himself, is expressed in their deep and their profound prayer. But it is always a sense of relation. So that when we see, when we summarize all the commandments and all the details and the programs of the law, they are summarized in the two great commandments of love of God, of love of neighbor. to be able to see what the church is a community. The church is a call to fraternity. The church is an encounter with God and an encounter with one another. So moving beyond ourselves, in the depths of every heart, love creates bonds and expands existence, where it draws people out of themselves and toward others. This is from the great angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas. And since we were made for love in each one of us, what is referred to a law of ecstasis seems to operate. The lover goes outside the self to find a fuller existence in one another. You know, and I was kind of intrigued by that expression, which I must admit I was not familiar with, a law of ecstasis, but which really is self-giving love, that by uniting ourselves with another, by serving another, by dying to ourselves so that we can live for ourselves, we are not diminishing ourselves when we reach out in service and love of one another, but our lives are profoundly enriched, which is kind of the law of ecstasis, that we become more fully alive insofar as we reach out in love and service of one another. And this idea of moving beyond ourselves, you know, is expressed in we need to move beyond our comfort zone. You know, that we all have our circle of friends and the circle of people that we're close to, are kind of our own support groups, and that is so very, very beautiful and needed. But the Lord always calls us to go out into the deep, to go take the risk of trusting in God, take the risk of reaching out to people beyond our cultures, our way of life. And that's why, and I'm thinking specifically when I look at Father Saranala right now, that he is such a beautiful blessing to our parish communities. It enables us to reach out and to experience it, for him to share a bit of his culture, a bit of his way of life, his way of thinking about spirituality, that we can be a blessing to him, and very much he can be a blessing to us. When we can welcome in our church a diversity, and to see that we are deeply enriched, and that we move beyond our own comfort zones, move beyond the sacred boundaries of Penfield or Webster, and encourage ourselves in the service of the wider community. You know, I love what a major commitment of St. Joseph's Parish, in which I have been involved in, is our mission to Tanzania. You know, to be in Africa and to be able to see how, when we reach out and live in Tanzania just for a couple of weeks, how my life was enriched and beautifully supported by experiencing the love and by sharing the love. And just in a word, to move beyond ourselves. Going on to the next slide is the sacred duty of hospitality. You know, significantly, many small communities living in desert areas developed a remarkable system of welcoming pilgrims as an exercise of the sacred duty of hospitality. The medieval monastic communities did likewise, as we did from the rule of Saint Benedict, while acknowledging that it might detract from the discipline and silence of monasteries. Benedict nonetheless insisted that the poor and the pilgrims be treated with the utmost care and attention, to be able to see in which Benedict lived out so beautifully in his way of life for the Benedictines. Yes, the church can never be a gated community. You know, it cannot be a group of haves and haves not, and that some people are more privileged than others, because the whole message of the Lord Jesus, that the Lord finds himself in the least and the forgotten and the marginalized. And I'm mindful of the question, which is really facing us very much in our Christmas masses. And it can be a little sensitive topic, and it's a very real topic that, you know, with the limited seating capacity because of these COVID days, in which we must keep people safe and feel comfortable and feel hospitable. And therefore it's appropriate, and that we require registration for the masses so that we can get a sense of it. But I'm also thinking about the person, the parishioners who come on Christmas Eve, who are basically clueless, so to speak, who may be outside of our network of people, but how we are to apply the rule of Saint Benedict, how we are to welcome them. What I would find very, very beautiful, and how is to work out if people who have registered, who are the most faithful parishioners in our parish, would give up their selected reserved seat in the pew and to welcome, someone who's really just a Christmas Easter Catholic, and have them sit in the first pew and say, "You are welcome," and then the registered people would maybe be in the gathering space or something like that. But the sense behind that is the sacred duty of hospitality, that it is a sense of how we welcome and how we be a church that reflects the hospitality of the parable of the Good Samaritan, that reflects the sense there is room in the inn for everyone on any day. Then going beyond to the next slide, the new unique value of love. The spiritual stature of a person's life is measured by love, which in the end remains the criteria of the definitive decision about a human life's worth or lack thereof. That one of the things that I often say, that the first requirement of a disciple of Jesus is to love. And that is really unmistakably the call, the commitment. It's the bottom line for all of us. And I think, and I look at the two popes, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, and I'm reminded of the beauty and the depth of the spirituality of each of our popes, of Pope Francis and Pope Benedict. But I'm also mindful that they had different ways of looking at spirituality. They had different emphasis. And what do we do, and how do we do with kind of when there's differences? I'm thinking of the halls of Congress. I'm thinking of the divisions, sharp divisions between the Republicans and the Democrats. And from the Republican point of view, they're all right and the Democrats are all wrong, and vice versa, the Democrats are all right and the Republicans are all wrong. Where do we have, in this unique value of love, room for dialogue, for love and respect for each person? How can division be replaced by a sense of encountering, of dialoguing, of listening, of loving one another? And we can even see, and I even see it in the church's spirituality. There's different ways of placing emphasis, and Pope Francis and Pope Benedict had different emphasis on, but to be able to see in that image of them listening and being with each other, respecting each other, dialoguing with each other, encountering each other, I think that's the God's plan, that's the gospel plan, and to be able to see the unique value of love, and that when we can bring together our divisions, our differences, and bring them back in a spirit of dialogue, of listening, of compassion, of forgiving, of loving, kind of a gospel way of living. So that's my wisdom. I'll turn it over to Kathy and Sadanala to further this.
Nancy, any questions or comments before we move on?
Just a couple of comments. One would be that it's really difficult in this day and age to not think of us as being a disposable society. So much of what we use, the containers, the disposable items that we use, that this person really kind of said that so much that we use is not permanent. And that the term "all are welcome" is just a great, great term to use for the church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we're going to move on to this concept of social friendship, which is also part of chapter 3. And we have this quote here, but just wanted to take a step back a few paragraphs earlier. You know, Pope Francis is talking about a love ever more open. And the first thing he says under there is that love impels us toward universal communion and reminds us that Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, "You all are brothers." And he goes on to talk about how, just as Father was just saying, that we need to be able to move beyond our comfortable social circles. Maybe not today because of COVID, but in principle. And he talks about how sometimes the peripheries between one group of people and another group of people are so close to us that it's hard to understand how we can see ourselves as apart from or separate from that other group of people. And I have to just share that when I moved here to initially to Penfield in 1995, it was actually kind of startling after I started to settle in and, you know, the kids started going to school, that I didn't realize how integrated Long Island, where I was coming from, how integrated Long Island was and how much we just took that for granted. I would say that my 5- and 7-year-old girls were relatively colorblind. But now we were in a suburb that was quite homogenous. And it wasn't for a while until I realized, I think partly getting involved in ministry in the church, that as homogenous as this community can seem, and certainly did then 25 years ago, we're only 7 or 8 miles away from one of the poorest communities in the country, in the city of Rochester. And it really can seem like such a wide gap, between our worlds here. I have a feeling if Pope Francis was familiar with our geography and our social structure here, he would be telling us to bridge that gulf between our communities as much as we possibly can. And I think the idea here in talking about social friendship, this love capable of transcending those kinds of even invisible borders, right? That probably are even more destructive than the ones that are so obvious. That really, it's not just about us going out and doing for people in other communities. It's about how do we form relationships with those people. And that could seem a little ironic in the moment here at St. Joseph's, because our halls are piled from floor to ceiling with stuff that we are about to share with people in some of those very communities that we're talking about. And that is an absolutely wonderful thing, that the expression of charity that people have here for the poor. But as important, if not even more important, is how we form relationships with people. Not that we are, I think in the chapters last week we talked about this, not that we are the people with the most who are giving to the people with the least, but rather how do we all come together in communion with one another. So the quote here about social friendship is that it is a love capable of transcending borders, that this is the basis of what in every city and country can be called social friendship. Genuine social friendship within a society makes true universal openness possible. So kind of just like even the way we talk about our faith, right? It has to start in the home, right? And then come out into, a wider community. So too with us, in small little communities like Penfield and the city of Rochester, if we can start to really model this kind of relationship building, what kind of impact could that have on a broader scale? So a challenge for us. And Pope Francis goes back and revisits what he talked about in the previous chapter, what we talked about last week, about the Good Samaritan. And just think about the characters, again, in that parable, and how it really underscores this idea that individualism can seem like, something that we, even as a country, really pride ourselves in. But does that really make us more free, more equal, more fraternal? And Pope Francis is certainly making the argument that it does not. He actually refers to radical individualism as a virus, a word we're very familiar with these days, and talks about how it's so hard to, move beyond individualism because it's so clever. It makes us think we're in charge. It makes us think, even that we're doing such good all on our own that it must be for the common good. You have to say, when I read that, I did think that might be even more of a danger in church ministry than anywhere else, right? That we think we're doing something so wonderful that it just must be for everybody else. So an interesting sort of thing to think about. But I do like that idea of getting beyond the idea of, associates and really having, truer relationships with people.
One of our attendees remembers a few years ago when our teen choir, Morning Star, used to go down and to our sister parish in the city and did our Lenten 7 Last Words of Jesus. And then they also did a couple of other prayerful performances as well. And it would be something to possibly revive, that we could share music and choirs with those that maybe don't have a choir, or we could learn by bringing choirs to us. That sounds like a really good idea. And going back to what we've been talking about, and to remember that Jesus didn't exclude anyone.
I think that's just a great suggestion in terms of the choirs in the 7 Last Words. When we did them together with a sister parish in an urban area, and how to bring together urban and suburban, whether we're talking about it with parishes twinning or being sister parishes to each other, or in the community. But that, as Kathy was suggesting, is a gospel challenge to us. It has to be a gospel embarrassment that the inequity between suburban Penfield and urban Rochester, which is in terms of the quality of education, the quality of their housing, and many opportunities that we need to, as a church, feel a significant restlessness and how we are going to service the poor and the needy in our urban areas. And we've talked about that, but we've got to move that talk into action. That it is really a statement that when people in the urban areas are in such need, and that we have the capability of serving them, of resourcing them, and what Penfield Hope is doing this afternoon, I think is a beautiful initiative on the part of the parish, and that we really need to continue to emphasize kind of the social outreach function of our parish life, when we see ourselves as the servants of people who are in need.
Mm-hmm. A beautiful example of that, Father, the early on in the pandemic, we had to curtail our activities with our Fill Up the Van, but that takes food that we collect here at the parish, but more broadly collects food every morning from Wegmans to take to, it used to be 4 or 5 shelters or food cupboards in the city of Rochester. And when they started back up, I think it was the middle of June, they kept coming back and telling us, gee, this place requested that they come there, and this place requested that they come here or there. And we were getting a little bit nervous that it might be a little beyond our scope of what we could, really do. But God bless them, this small group of parishioners just kept recruiting, more people to their team until they really had a very strong team for each, day of the week. And then Food Link jumped in because they heard what they were doing. And basically, a wonderful plan came together where they now pick up from 2 different Wegmans and a Target. And then deliver to, I think now it's something like, I can't even keep track. It's something like 8 or 9 different organizations in the city. And what's beautiful about it is just the relationships that they have established, not just with, the very long-term partners that we've had, but people who are really reaching out because just the need is greater than ever. And they really seem to go in and learn what each place needs so that they're not just dumping stuff on them, which is very easy to do, but understanding, what the needs are of each place and trying, day by day to tailor what they do for them. So a big shout out to those guys. They've done an amazing, amazing job. And especially, now as everyone's getting nervous and concerned about the numbers, of course, we need to, the COVID numbers, we need to talk again about whether, we need to possibly pull back a little bit, but we do so confident that the spirit of this will never go away. The parish is just so deeply committed to it, and that there's somehow always individuals that step in and make it work. So,
And that certainly has been the vision of Pope Francis in all areas of life, that North America needs to be at the service of South America. If North America is more affluent and the needs in many areas, although there are many ways that South America is of service to North America, but the point is that it's not, we're in competition with each other, and that we've got to make one greater than the other. And it's the same way St. Joseph's Church. It's not that we want to need to be the best in the supreme parish of the diocese, but that we need to be a parish in the diocese that serves and is known by our service to other people. The town of Penfield, we want to keep it protected from outside influences. Rather than that outlook, we need to see we in Penfield have resources that enable us to serve the urban areas of our community, and all the ways that we can do that. But that really needs to be, and it clearly is the challenge of Pope Francis, and it's the challenge of the Lord Jesus himself, of course.
just another couple of thoughts on this idea of social friendship, perhaps leading up to one of the most challenging thoughts. Social friendship and universal fraternity necessarily call for an acknowledgement of the worth of every human person, always and everywhere. And I think we would all nod our heads and say that's absolutely true, right? And then in the next article after this, he says, every human being has the right to live with dignity and to develop integrally. This fundamental right cannot be denied by any country. People have this right even if they are unproductive or were born with any kind of limitations. And I think sometimes for us as a nation, we can have very, very good intentions, but that idea of, someone is receiving government benefits because they're choosing not to work, or they're lazy, or whatever, is something that unfortunately I think lots of us, really grew up with that kind of in our heads. We have to be productive members of society. That's a good thing. But if you're not, that's kind of on you. And I think that's a hard thing for us to, sort of undo, right, in our way of thinking, that even people, for whatever reason, who are unproductive still are worthy of respect and being treated with dignity. And I know that's always one of the dark sides of, even some of our charitable efforts and things like Penfield Hope. Every once in a while you get that question. but how do you know these people aren't really ripping you off? You know, how do you know you're not being manipulated? And I always think back to our retired Deacon Bill Coffey, who one particular Christmas a number of years ago, I was struggling with, we did have a couple of characters who were knocking on our door, and it was hard to know what to do. And Deacon Bill said, well, Kathy, just think about it. Would you knock on somebody's door and ask for food if you didn't need it? And I've always just kept that in my mind. And he went further and said, so if one or two, you know, are taking advantage, who cares? Because really, in the end, we're there to serve the people who need and, you know, really have the courage to come and knock on the door and say, I have a need. So I've always remembered that. I think that's so important. But it can be, you know, easy to get caught up in this idea of, you know, how are we really vetting people? And I think one of the things we're proudest of with Penfield Hope is that the answer to that question is we talk to people. We get to know them. It's not about making them produce documentation. You know, it's about trying to understand what's the underlying problem, not just that I need food today, but kind of how did somebody get to that point? How can we help, you know, make sure that they're tapping into all the resources that they can, or, you know, help them just think through their own solutions. And I think that's the main thing, getting back to that word of encounter, is really just spending time with people, getting to know people, forming those relationships.
Sure. And I think later on in encyclical, we get even this whole sense dramatically with the death penalty. You know, you can think of people who in all human ways deserve the worst possible penalty in the world, that they have really been violent, they have been very hurtful, but Pope Francis calls us, and rightly so, that everyone has dignity. Even people who have abused others, and it doesn't give us permission to not treat each and every person on the face of the earth with some dignity and with some respect. And that's a hard pill to swallow when you can realize that people are taking advantage of the system. But even if they are taking advantage of the system, it's worth giving and loving. You know, it's loving your enemy. It's forgiving as the Lord forgives us. You know, so it's a very challenging, but it's a very gospel question.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple of questions here to just think about or respond in the chat about, you know, this idea, do we really need a community? And do you feel you need, you know, others? Do you feel you need that sense of community to practice your faith? Any other comments in there, Nancy, that we should pause for? No, okay.
Nope, not at this time.
Father Sadnala, anything you wanted to add? Put him on the spot.
You have to unmute you there.
Yes, thank you. Yes, yeah. So, in order to, you know, it's just like this maybe chapter, like, you know, summary maybe like, you know, so God is, we know the love, and we share in that same love. And then we are part of that love. So therefore we are all called upon that having that universal fraternity. In other words, like, you know, open to all. You know, in this sense, there are no others. There are no them. There is no me, or there is no I, there is no myself. But it's a kind of only us. When you have that feeling of us, and then there is a sense of community. You know, if you consider someone else as the other, he becomes the other, and I become me, myself. You know, I remember a wonderful story, you know, in the olden days, seems, I don't know, Nancy, you know, when you play a piano, there would be somebody to pump the air, right? So, you know, there was one wonderful guy, excellent player, and he was giving a concert, and then half is done. So the one who was behind the pumping the air came forward and said, "Oh, we have done very well." And the player felt so embarrassed. "It is I who have done that. And how can you say that we have done well?" And then half is done, and then there's a break. And then after the break, you know, he was thinking for himself, "Oh, I made a mistake. If he were to keep everything in his mind and stop pumping the air, oh my God, what happens? Whatever I do, no sound comes out. Oh no, that's not the way." So, but thank God, the person one who was pumping the air continued his duty. And then at the end of the, you know, the concert, end of the play, so the player leaves everything and hugs the person who pumped the air and tells him, "We have done well." You know, it's a kind of a community spirit. It's no more of myself or no more of other, but rather we ourselves, like, you know, us. And then when you have that community spirit, then naturally there is a possibility for us to have this social friendship and then universal fraternity, and at the same time feeling of that oneness with the poor, you know. So that's what really the Pope Francis wanted all of us to have. No more of feeling of myself, no more of feeling of other, but rather feeling of us coming together.
I love that. That sense of us is so important, because you're so right. As soon as we start talking about, you know, them and us, it's all over. We've got to see ourselves as one. Thank you for that. You know, this idea of promoting the moral good, there's a lot packed into these couple of little sentences. So, you know, the needy generally practice the special solidarity that exists among those who are poor and suffering. And I think that's something that many of us who, you know, live certainly in, you know, suburban comfort might just go right by that. But I can tell you one of the experiences that I had a number of years ago when we were working on our Bethany House mentoring project, and I was working with a woman who had been released from prison just a short while before, and you know, had never been someone good at budgeting her own money. So, you know, with a group of people, certainly not on my own steam, you know, had been working to help her get reestablished with her benefits for her and her child. And, you know, this had been a long effort. So when she finally did receive some money, and I talked to her about a week later, she told me she had bought a television for her friend. And I, you know, about lost my mind. I couldn't believe it. You know, we had worked so hard to get her this money, and she went out and bought a television for her friend. It was just mind-boggling to me. But I realized over time working with her that this was just the way that people who don't have generally live with each other. If I have today and you have a need, then I'm going to give that to you, because when it's me who needs a month from now, I'm going to trust that you're going to take care of me. I mean, not that it's all that simple and people don't get all crazed about who owes who what, but there is just much more of a sense of kind of the common good, that everything, as we would say, you know, in the Acts of the Apostles, is shared in common. Even to the point of what probably most of us who, you know, very carefully manage our budgets would find, you know, just downright, you know, unthinkable in terms of, you know, just giving away money or stuff or lending like that. So it's an interesting cultural dynamic, I think, that's very different, that most of us would not think that way. then this idea that solidarity is a word that is not always well received. It can become a dirty word, a word that dare not be said. And I think we probably have seen a lot of this in our American politics in the last year or so, where, you know, any program that's proposed by a politician that sounds like something that would probably fit under the solidarity category suddenly becomes socialism, right? That kind of immediate blanketing of ideas. But the Pope frequently writes about this, the idea that solidarity means much more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. I think this is the third or fourth document I've seen that phrase in. Sporadic acts of generosity, I think for Pope Francis, is almost equivalent to sinfulness, right? That it's not about making myself feel good because I give you something. It's much more about relationship. It's more about entering into a sense of this oneness in community with one another, not just that we give once and then we feel good. This idea of sporadic acts of generosity is not high on his list. It's a part of what we do, but it's not the be all and the end all for sure.
A comment was that I think the way that we were raised to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, it has to be for us a paradigm shift, I think, in that we need a community, but we also need to come out of our, as Father Jim said, come out of our comfort zone and to really look differently at how we give and how we act, for sure. But the comment was we definitely do need community, but like you just said, to be able to think about it differently, that it's not sporadic giving, it's us rather than I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things we also need to remember with Pope Francis is he's taking us obviously to a real biblical kind of spirituality and also sense of society, but also remember that he is coming from, you know, a Hispanic culture, a South American culture that is very, very different from what most of us would be accustomed to. And that's, you know, another important perspective to have. And much of his sort of philosophy about all of this was really developed as he was working and ministering in very, very poor areas of Argentina.
And someone else made a comment that really makes sense as well, that there will always be people who may take advantage of help programs, but there are so many others that don't take advantage and who really need it. And so our job, our ministry, our passion would be to make sure that we find and help find all who are in need, so that there is no one that goes without.
So true. Father Jim, do you want to pick up?
Okay, yes. Just to be able to see, you know, to speak of a paradigm shift, this section of Pope Francis' encyclical is really challenging us to that and kind of re-envisioning the social role of property. You know, going back to the Acts of the Apostles, when they shared everything in common. And then one of the most telling words was, there was no one in need among them. It really was that sense of the social role of property. The world exists for everyone because all were born with the same dignity. You know, and what Pope Francis is saying, as a community, we have an obligation to ensure that everyone lives with dignity. You know, and the paradigm shift is because that how in the American way of life that we're taught that we raised to be strong individuals, to be self-reliant, to be educated, to earn is a good wage so that you can have possessions. You know, that private property is an American way of life. You know, even this church complex of St. Joseph's. You know, we have definitely boundary lines that are sacred, and that there's much litigation if you invade someone else's property with your fence or anything like that. But it's just a way of life that we have our houses and that we have our private property, and that we're very pleased with that. And the more spacious our private property is, that we can be proud of. But really what the gospel and this encyclical is called, that the most basic principle, the first principle, is not my right to private property, but it must always be the principle of the common good, and the principle of community, of created goods, that they are meant to be shared by all, you know. And that's that kind of the inequality of wealth, you know, in terms of who has the private property and the most expansive property, and how that is meant to be shared, you know. That kind of goes against kind of the American way, and kind of the capitalism, you know, and to think of sharing it gets smacked down as socialism. But it's really, in some way, sharing is the gospel, and that we have to be conscious that everyone has dignity, everyone has rights, and that what we have is for the sharing, you know. And that can be pious words in a homily, but how they become part of our way of life is the challenge. And it, you know, certainly we were referring to before in terms of the difference between urban Rochester and suburban Rochester, just as an example, that suburbia, you know, has the lion's share of private property, and that's the way we like it. Thank you very much, kind of attitude. And so we really need to re-envision the social role of property. And going on to that next slide, you know, that not to share our own wealth with the poor is theft from the poor and deprivation of their means of life. We do not possess our own wealth, but theirs, you know. And that is really a very, very challenging kind of thing. In the words of Pope Gregory the Great, when we provide the needy with their basic needs, we are not giving them what belongs to them. We're giving them what belongs to them, and not to us. You know, and that is really the gospel challenge that needs to take to the heart of this, and how that sense of sharing, how that we do that, how, you know, that we're interested in our private property, the borders that we have, the private property of the United States of America, of ourselves as a nation, and that separates us from other countries, and that we take great pride and we possess that mightily. But we need to have a heart open to the whole world. A person who thinks only about building walls wherever they may be and not building bridges is not Christian. This is not in the gospel. Pope Francis is not trying to make a political statement. Pope Francis is trying to make a gospel statement that we need to welcome, that we need to see Christ in the immigrant and the poor and the forgotten, the urban person. That, you know, what I was struck in terms of preparing the homily for the Feast of Christ the King, the last judgment scene, that Christ has disappeared in our midst, and where he will be found is in the poor and the marginalized and the immigrants and the forgotten people of society, the people with disabilities, the people who are taking advantage of us. That is where Christ is to be found. So that we have to have and need to have a heart open to the whole world. And that has to be the vision of church, the vision of politics, the vision of nationalism. You know, the nationalism is not the first principle of life. The first principle of life is the global community that we need to recognize and to serve and recognize the dignity of each and every person.
Father, we have an interesting couple of comments that agreed that everyone should have the basics of life, such as shelter, food, and that Habitat for Humanity is such a wonderful way of doing that important work, helping our poorer families become homeowners. However, this is all of this concept of the world and property is a slippery slope, and that perhaps the human race may only be equal in God's eyes. So I wonder what you might say to that.
Yes, and I think it's equal in God's eyes, but our challenge is to look at the world with the mind and the heart and the eyes of God, you know, and that is the challenge. You know, you're absolutely right. Left to our own devices, you know, we value, you know, this is mine. I've worked hard for it. Other people have not worked as hard as I have, so they don't deserve it. I mean, that's kind of an understandable human mindset. But if we are going to take on the heart of Jesus, then we need to have that kind of mindset. Yes, it is a radical open-mindedness, but to say that everyone deserves dignity. We need to share what we have with one another.
There are so many homes, this just came to my mind, so many homes now that have the Ring doorbell and the cameras outside,
Yeah.
to eliminate anybody coming onto the property at all times of the day. So we really do have a lot of work to do in changing our minds and to be the heart and the mind of God, I think.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Back to you, Kathy.
So, we're talking about this idea of eliminating borders. One of the things that, Pope Francis reminds us of is that, when we talk about welcoming people, we're not saying that, people migrating from, say, a poorer country to a country like the United States is the be all and the end all. Much better is to keep people in their home countries, but with provisions for their basic needs, and that we have so far to go as a globe until that happens, that for now, our responsibility, he says here, our response to the arrival of migrating persons can be summarized in 4 words: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. The images here are 3 of our parishioners working with refugees at Mary's Place. Not recently, as you can see, there's no masks. This was, these pictures were taken maybe a year or 2 ago. Fran Cardella, Paula Cardella, and Tom Glisson. And that's one of the ministries as a parish that we absolutely love, because it gives us this very hands-on way to work with refugees and really help them, especially address that last word, to integrate, to give them opportunities to learn the language in a conversational way, opportunities to take citizenship tests when they're ready for that, to enter into the job market, which can be things so very, very basic, like the importance of being on time. That's something we as Americans just take for granted, that if I tell you you have an appointment at 9 o'clock, you're going to be there at 9 o'clock. But that's not so for every culture. So just, teaching some of those very basic things about how to integrate, into this society and be able to become self-sustaining here. So that's just a ministry we love, that we believe really is our opportunity, along with others, many other parishes in the community that support Mary's Place, to welcome, to protect, to promote, and integrate. And the other thing that Pope Francis talks about is this idea of mutual assistance. and this, we could probably spend another whole webinar on, so I won't go dive too deep here, but the idea that, well, very often that it is the people living in poverty who are most impacted by things going on in other parts of the world that create pollution, for example. But that all of these things are interrelated, right? So the things that end up in our oceans because they're not recycled or do not, are not biodegradable, end up on the shores, disastrously of the countries where you have the most poverty and that sort of thing, just a simple example. So that idea that we need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are either all saved together or no one is saved. Poverty, decadence, and suffering in one part of the earth are a silent breeding ground for problems that will end up affecting the entire planet. So this idea that we're all somehow, interconnected. The Pope also talks here about an innate tension between this idea of globalization and localization. And that we don't want to get caught in one extreme or the other, right? That on the one extreme, everything becomes kind of, local folklore, and the other, that we can have such a global outlook that's way too broad to accomplish anything. I have to admit, when I read this, I was thinking, true of the church as well, right? That there's always this tension between kind of empowering local cultures and also, having a very global view of our Catholicism, right? So that that's a tension that exists, everywhere in our church as well. And, one of the things that people have been talking about during the pandemic is how it has really cut Pope Francis's travels. Very much, one of the things he was known for was really traveling all over the world. That map is showing just the countries that he had been to prior to the pandemic, since he had become Pope. And so, for a healthy relationship between love of one's own country and a sound sense of belonging to our larger human family, it's helpful to keep in mind that global society is not the sum of different countries, but rather, what is the communion that exists between them? And I think we can look at Pope Francis's travel not as just, trotting the globe, but really his way of trying to build communion, particularly between our Catholic communities in those various countries, but other faith communities as well.
Kathy, a couple of the comments as we begin to close out. One was that we have to be very careful when we listen too much to the TV or to social media when it comes to immigration and those people who are migrating. There is a danger of that single story, seeing migrants as dangerous and to be avoided, which really isn't the case at all. Those stories we have to really take with a grain of salt and do our research. But also in the same kind of vein, that learning perspectives that never might have occurred to you can come through small groups like Christ Life and Sharing Faith, that you really come to a whole different understanding of things when you listen to others. So that, again, from Father Sadhanala's, it's not me, it's us. It's not the other, but it's all of us together. And all of our viewpoints together make that universal or unified body and community.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful point, and thank you for that segue. That leads exactly to the last sort of quote that I wanted to share, because I think it applies both to this, larger topic that we're talking about here in terms of, fraternity as a society overall, but also for ourselves in our faith life. And so, not to push our Advent season too fast, but obviously coming up this weekend, we have Gaudete Sunday and, you know, our Sunday of joy. And I just love this quote from Pope Francis. It says, to see things in this way of having what we just talked about, this healthy relationship between countries, to see things in this way brings the joyful realization that no one people, culture, or individual can achieve everything on its own. To attain fulfillment in life, we need others. And I think certainly that applies to our faith life, you know, as well as these big societal issues. So I think we will conclude with prayer and then see you again next week. Father Jim, do you want to read this prayer for us?
Igalento. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important, that all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. Amen.
So thank you everyone for being with us. Again, we do invite your comments and thoughts during the week by email, and otherwise we will see you back here next Monday.
Next Monday.
See you then. Thank you.
Look forward to sharing next Monday as well.